You know, they say you can't hear a picture, but I can. Even now, all these years later, if I close my eyes, I can hear them. Not the guns, not the screams, those are different ghosts. I'm talking about the music. The big, brassy fanfares, the voice of that announcer, so deep and confident, like God himself was reading the bulletins. German forces continue their unstoppable advance. That's what was in our heads as we marched east in the summer of '43. We'd seen it all in the newsreels at the cinema back home before they shipped us out. Our tanks were giants, our soldiers were heroes with clean uniforms and sharp chins, and the enemy, well, the enemy was always running. That's what we carried with us, that fanfare, that promise. It was like a song you can't get out of your head, and you hum it to keep your spirits up when your boots are full of blisters and the Russian dust gets in your teeth. We clung to those images, to that feeling of invincibility, because what else did we have? It was our fuel, more than the thin soup and the black bread. We were told this was the great decisive blow, that after Kursk, the Russian spine would be broken, and we could all start thinking about going home. That was the specific promise we held on to, a little secret hope tucked away in our ammo pouches next to the photograph of a girl or a letter from your mother. But with every mile we marched deeper into that damned steppe, the music in our heads started to get fainter, and the lie of it all began to itch like a wool tunic in the July heat. I remember the feeling in the air the night before it all started, a kind of quiet that was heavier than any noise. It wasn't peaceful, it was a waiting. You could taste it, this metallic tang of fear and anticipation. And then the world ended. That's not an exaggeration. The morning came not with the sun, but with fire. The entire horizon, from one end to the other, just erupted. This wasn't the neat bang-bang-bang of the artillery you see in training, or even the sharp crack of the 88s we were used to. This was a roar, a continuous, deafening quake that came up through the soles of your boots and rattled your teeth in your skull. The newsreels showed you flashes and puffs of smoke, but they never showed you the sound, the physical force of it that made your insides feel like jelly. The sky turned black, but not from clouds, from dirt and smoke and hell itself. And then we saw them. At first they were just specks on the vast, flat emptiness, but the specks didn't stop coming. It was like the whole steppe was moving against us, a tide of green and brown. I saw a kid next to me, couldn't have been more than 18, just like I was, and he was staring with his mouth open, and he said, "Where did they all come from?" That was the question, wasn't it? The newsreels always showed us hordes of disorganized Ivan running away. They never showed you this ocean of men and machines coming right at you, with a fury that seemed to suck the air right out of your lungs. And our invincible tanks, the Panthers and the Ferdinands we'd been told would win the day, we saw them too. We saw them burning. That's the image that's burned into me more than any other. A brand new Panther, its sleek dark green hull looking like some monster from a futuristic novel, sitting in a field with its turret blown clean off, smoke pouring out of the hole like a funeral pyre. And right next to it, an old Panzer III, the kind we all knew was obsolete, burning just the same. The fire doesn't care if you're new or old, invincible or expendable. It just burns. You'd see the crews bailing out, their coveralls on fire, rolling in the dirt, and the smell got the smell. It's a sweet, sickly, horrible smell of cooked meat and burning oil and petrol. You never forget that smell. It gets in your clothes, in your nose, in your soul. We'd been told these machines were unstoppable, but there they were, stopped. Permanently. And for every one of ours, it felt like 10 of their T-34s would clatter forward, some of them on fire, just rolling on until they couldn't any more, a kind of terrifying, mindless courage that made a mockery of our tactical superiority. We fought, of course we fought. You fire your rifle until the barrel is too hot to touch. You throw your grenades. You scream until your throat is raw, but it's like trying to stop a flood with your hands. The noise, the confusion, the sheer, overwhelming scale of it, it strips you down to your most basic self. All the ideology, all the promises from the high-ups, all that newsreel nonsense just evaporates. All that's left is the man next to you, the hole you're lying in, and the primal need to see the next sunrise. After days of that, maybe a week, time lost all meaning, things changed. There was no loudspeaker announcement, no order read out from the Führerhauptquartier. It was quieter than that, more insidious. It was a whisper passed from foxhole to foxhole, from a lieutenant with haunted eyes and a grimy map. New positions, they called it. a tactical withdrawal to straighten the line. You didn't need to be a general to understand the words they weren't saying. We were pulling back. The great, decisive offensive, the blow that was to win the war, was over, and we were the ones moving west. Not advancing, not victorious, retreating. That word was forbidden, of course. It was always repositioning or elastic defense. But you can't dress up the sight of a broken army. You'd see these columns of men, no longer units, just men. Faces grey with dust and exhaustion, eyes that looked right through you. They'd be trudging past, some without rifles, some supporting a buddy who could barely walk. And the equipment, or what was left of it, a horse-drawn cart with a broken wheel, piled with wounded men who moaned with every jolt. A half-track abandoned with a seized engine, its crew just gone. It was a river of defeat flowing west, and we were now a part of it. And the most bitter pill was the contrast. In the rare moments we'd get a radio signal, we'd sometimes hear the broadcasts from home. The announcer's voice, that same confident, booming voice, would talk about heavy fighting and our brave soldiers exacting a heavy toll on the enemy. He'd use words like planned regrouping and talk about the unshakable spirit of the Wehrmacht. And we'd sit there, in the mud, eating a cold can of tinned beef, listening to this fairy tale about some other war, some other army. That's when the dark humor started, the soldier's last defense. A guy named Erich, a Berliner with a sharp wit, would say, "Well, listen to that, Hans. We must be winning after all. I must have missed the victory parade while I was digging this hole." And you'd laugh, a dry, hollow laugh that had no joy in it, because if you didn't laugh, you'd cry, or worse, you'd start thinking about how utterly abandoned you were. That's when the real shift happened, not on the battlefield, but inside our heads. We stopped talking about the newsreels altogether. It was an unspoken pact, a silent understanding among us. Before Kursk, you might have a young, eager recruit who'd say something like, "Did you see the newsreel about our new rockets?" And an older veteran would just grunt and look away. After Kursk, that recruit was either dead or he'd learned. No one mentioned the broadcasts anymore. It was like admitting you still believed in Santa Claus. The faith was broken, and in its place was a cold, hard certainty. We were on our own. The men who wrote those reports and made those films lived in a different world, a clean, orderly world where lines on a map meant something. They didn't live in our world, a world of mud and blood and the screams of your friends. They didn't know the taste of fear, which is like sucking on a copper coin. They didn't know the feel of a comrade's hand growing cold in yours as you tried to stop a wound that couldn't be stopped. You start to notice small things, intimate things, that mean more than any grand strategy. The way France, a farmer's son from Bavaria, could make a tiny stove out of a tin can and brew a halfway decent coffee that felt like a taste of heaven. The way we'd all share letters from home, not just the contents, but the physical paper, the smell of home on it. The way we'd huddle together for warmth in a dugout, not saying a word, just sharing body heat, each man's breath a small promise to the others that we were still here, still alive. The homesickness was a physical ache, worse than any hunger. You'd dream of your mother's cooking, not some grand feast, but the simple smell of fresh bread, or the way the air smelled after a rain back home. You'd think about a girl you de-kissed, and the memory of her perfume would be so vivid it would hurt. That's what you fought for then. Not for the fatherland, not for glory. You fought for the man next to you, because you didn't want to be the one to let him down. You fought for the chance, however slim, to one day go back to that ordinary, quiet life you'd been so desperate to leave when you were a dumb kid who believed the newsreels. I remember one specific moment. It was during the retreat, if we're honest and call it what it was. We were hiding in a bombed-out village, just a few scattered brick walls and cellars. I was on watch, looking out over this field that was littered with the wreckage of war. The sun was setting, casting this beautiful red glow over everything, making the burned-out tanks look like strange sculptures. And for a second, it was quiet, not peaceful but quiet, and it hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't a thought about tactics or the war. It was a simple, terrifying realization. We are not going to win this war. We are not the invincible army from the films. We are just men, tired, scared, bloody men, and we are losing. And the goal wasn't victory anymore. The goal was survival. Getting through the next minute, the next hour, the next day, making it home. That was the only victory that mattered. And from that moment on, everything was different. You listened to the radio announcements with a new ear, a bitter, ironic ear. You heard the lies not as motivation, but as a cruel joke. The fanfare music was gone, replaced by the wind whistling over the steppe and the distant thump of artillery, always getting closer. We had seen the truth with our own eyes, smelled it, tasted it, and after that, you could never believe the pictures again. You could only believe the man shivering in the foxhole next to you and the shared, silent hope that you might both live to see a tomorrow where the only noise was the sound of peace. They trained us to be machines, you see. Not men, but instruments of mercy, cogs in a great, efficient machine. In the medical training camps back in Germany, everything was so clean. The bandages were always sterile and white. The splints were perfectly measured wood. The aid stations we practiced setting up were neat little oases of order, with everything in its place. They told us that with skill, with speed, with the precise application of a tourniquet or the correct suture, every man could be saved. Every single one. We believed it. I believed it. I was young, and the belief felt good, like a solid weight in my pocket. I would lay out my kit at the end of each day, checking and rechecking the instruments, running my thumb over the cool, smooth glass of the morphine syrettes. These were my tools. With these hands, I would fix things. I would push back against the chaos. It was a promise, unspoken but absolute. Then they sent us east, into the vastness of Russia, and then they sent us to Kursk, and the promise shattered into a million bloody pieces. At first, it was just the noise, a physical thing that hit you in the chest and never, ever stopped. The earth shook for days, a constant, grinding tremor that came up through the soles of your boots and into your teeth. The sky was never blue, only a dirty gray from the smoke and the dust. And then the first wounded came, a trickle at first, men with shrapnel wounds from artillery, and we handled it. We were doing what we were trained to do, but the trickle became a stream, and then a flood, a tidal wave of broken flesh that just kept coming. Our neat, orderly aid station, a dugout in a small ravine that we'd lined with medical crates, became a charnel house in a matter of hours. The smell is what I remember most from those first days of the retreat, a thick, coppery smell of blood that clung to the back of your throat, mixed with the stench of torn earth, cordite, and the sweet, foul odor of ripid-open intestines. The sound was a low, constant moan, a chorus of pain that was the background music to our hell. My hands, my trained, steady hands, became useless. It wasn't about skill anymore. It was about volume. You'd kneel next to one man, trying to stanch the pumping red fountain from his leg, and you'd hear another screaming for his mother just a few feet away. You'd look up and see 10 more being carried in or stumbling in on their own, their faces grey with shock, their uniforms stained dark. That's when they taught you the real lesson, the one that wasn't in the manual, triage. It's a clean, clinical word for the most gut-wrenching choice a man can make. You have to walk among them quickly, your eyes scanning, judging. This one with the belly wound, he's gone. You just move past him, his eyes pleading, but you have to harden your heart. This one with the leg nearly off, but the bleeding slow, he can wait. This one with the clean hole in his shoulder, he's a walking wounded. You slap a field dressing on it and point him to the rear. But this one, this boy who can't be more than 18, with a sucking chest wound, every breath a wet, desperate gasp, he gets your time. You fumble with the plaster, your fingers slick with someone else's blood, trying to seal the hole to give his lung a chance. And all the while, you feel the eyes of the ones you've passed over on you. You feel their silent accusation, their hope turning to despair. You're not a savior anymore. You're a judge delivering a death sentence with a glance. I remember one soldier, an Oberjefreiter with a grizzled look, holding what was left of his arm against his chest. He was silent, just staring at the wall of the dugout. I went to him and he just shook his head. "Don't waste your supplies on me, Doc," he muttered, his voice rough. "Just give me a cigarette." I lit one for him and put it between his lips. His good hand was trembling so bad he couldn't hold it. He took a long drag, closed his eyes, and leaned his head back. That small act of denial, of him knowing he was finished, hit me harder than any scream. That was the moment the last of my training, that clean, orderly world, truly evaporated. We were no longer medics. We were men trying to stuff chaos back into a box that had already burst open. Then the order came to pull back. It wasn't an order, it was a panic. "Schnell, schnell, the Russians are breaking through." The officers' voices were sharp with a fear I'd never heard before. We had to go. Now. And that meant we had to leave them. The wounded who couldn't walk. We had to leave them behind. I can still hear the sound. The moaning stopped for a moment, replaced by something worse, a desperate, rising chorus of pleas. Kamerad, nicht zurücklassen, bitte, don't leave me. They knew what it meant. To be left was to be captured, or worse, butchered by the advancing infantry. I was grabbing what few supplies I could carry, my heart hammering against my ribs, my hands shaking not from fatigue, but from a shame so profound it felt like a physical illness. I saw a young lieutenant I'd treated earlier, a boy with bright blue eyes and a piece of shrapnel in his thigh. He'd been brave, joking about the blighty wound that would send him home to Berlin. He couldn't walk. He was propped against a crate, and as I moved past him, our eyes met. His face, which had been so full of youthful arrogance just hours before, was now a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the understanding of his fate. It was a look that has never left me. I stopped. I couldn't just walk away. I fumbled in my bag and found a blanket. I laid it over him. It was a pathetic, meaningless gesture, a thin wool blanket against the certainty of death or Siberian captivity, but it was all I had to give. He knew what it meant. That blanket was his shroud. He closed his eyes then, a single tear cutting a path through the grime on his cheek. I turned and ran, the sound of his silent despair louder in my ears than the incoming artillery. And then there were the syrettes. My morphine syrettes, the ones I had once thought were instruments of relief. They became something else in those final, chaotic hours. For the ones we had to leave behind, the ones who were too far gone to even have a chance, the ones suffering unimaginable agony from wounds that were plainly mortal, we had another duty, a mercy. You would kneel beside a man whose insides were laid bare, a man who was drowning in his own blood, his eyes rolling back in his head with the pain. And you would take out a syrette, prick it, and squeeze the contents into his arm. Not to ease his pain for the journey, because there would be no journey. It was a larger dose, a final gift. The weight of that small glass tube in my hand felt like a ton of lead. You'd watch the tension leave their face, see the pain recede, replaced by a strange, distant peace. Then you'd stand up and move to the next, your soul feeling blacker, heavier with each one. You were playing guard, but not the guard of life, the guard of death. And you told yourself it was mercy. You had to believe it was mercy, because the alternative was to admit you were just killing the men you swore to save. The retreat was a nightmare of its own. We stumbled back through villages that were already burning, joining a river of desperate, demoralized men. There was no front line anymore, just a frantic scramble to get west. We'd hitch rides on the back of half-tracks overloaded with grim-faced soldiers, or we'd just walk, our boots crunching on the frozen ground, the cold seeping into your bones. The camaraderie was different now. The jokes were gone, replaced by a sullen silence or muttered curses about the high command, about the whole verdammt war. You'd see a man break down, just sit by the side of the road and weep, and no one would say a word. You'd just keep walking. You became numb, an automaton putting one foot in front of the other. The only thing that felt real was the constant, grinding hunger in your belly and the bone-deep exhaustion that sleep could never cure. You'd dream of the wounded, of the ones you left behind, and wake up in a cold sweat, the pleading voices still echoing in your skull. Weeks later, after what felt like an eternity of running and freezing and scavenging for food, my unit was pulled into a relatively quiet sector to regroup. We were billeted in a battered Ukrainian town, sleeping in actual houses for the first time in months. There was a semblance of order again. We were issued clean uniforms, or at least cleaner ones, and we got hot rations. And one evening, they rounded us up in the town square. A propaganda company unit had set up a projector and a screen. They were going to show us the newsreels, to boost our morale, they said. We stood there, a crowd of filthy, hollow-eyed men, and watched the flickering images. The narrator's voice was booming, confident, the voice we'd all heard 100 times before in cinemas back home. He spoke of the heroic struggle at Kursk, of the orderly and disciplined withdrawal of our forces, of inflicting massive casualties on the Bolshevik hordes. The footage showed neat lines of panzers moving in perfect formation, not the bog-down, burning hulks we'd abandoned. It showed soldiers with clean uniforms advancing purposefully, not the stumbling, terrified wretches we had become. It showed our fighters smiling, confident. There was no blood. There was no mud. There were no screams. It was a beautiful, clean, heroic lie. And I stood there listening to that voice, and I felt a hot, sour anger rise up from my gut. My hands, which I had scrubbed raw with snow and canteen water, still felt stained. I could still smell the blood. I could still hear the moans. I could still see the look in that young lieutenant's eyes as I covered him with that blanket. This, THIS Chinese letter, this show, was an insult. It was a spit in the face of every man I'd tried to save, and every man I'd failed. The narrator's voice, once so stirring, now sounded grotesque, obscene. When the film showed a shot of a field hospital with tidy rows of cots and efficient medics, a few men around me actually laughed, a short, bitter, hollow sound. I didn't laugh, I just stared. The disconnect was so vast, so absolute, it was like a chasm had opened up between the world on that screen and the world I had lived in. That was the moment I stopped believing, not just in the newsreels, but in everything they had ever told us. The promise of order was a joke. The belief that we were part of some grand, noble cause felt like ash in my mouth. The cheers that the narrator urged from an unseen audience sounded like they were coming from another planet, a planet of fools who had no idea what this war, this real war, truly was. We had seen the face of it, we had felt its breath, and we knew that nothing would ever be clean or orderly or right again. You never forget the taste of real bread. Not this black, gritty stuff they started giving us later, but real bread, the kind we had just before it all started, before the earth opened up. This was back in the spring of '43, a lifetime ago. We were massed up for this big push, this grand offensive they were promising would break the Russian back for good. And for a few days, they fed us like kings, or at least like men who were about to do something important. I remember the smell of that field kitchen, a proper one, not the mobile goulash cannons we got later. The air was thick with the scent of real coffee, not that ersatz rubbish made from roasted barley that tastes like burnt dirt. And the bread, God, the bread. It was a proper rye loaf, the crust crackling when you broke it, the inside soft and warm, the kind of bread my mother would have been proud to bake. You de-smear it with real butter, not that margarine that tastes of nothing but salt and regret, and maybe a bit of sausage. That first bite, it wasn't just food. It was a promise. It was the taste of the might of the Reich, they told us. It was the taste of the victory that was just around the corner. We were strong, well-fed, invincible. I sat with my Kameraden Willie, the big Saxon with hands like shovels, and little Klaus, who was always writing letters to his girl back in Hamburgand. We shared a cigarette, the good Turkish kind, not the cheap French ones we'd learned to smoke later. We broke that bread between us, a proper meal, and we talked about the future, not the war. We talked about going home, about what we'd do, the jobs we'd have, the families we'd start. The bread tasted like hope. It's funny, the things you cling to. I remember the weight of that full bread bag on my hip, a comfortable, reassuring weight. It meant we were cared for. It meant the machine worked. We were the spearhead, and the spearhead had to be sharp. That's what the lieutenant said. We believed him. We believed everything then. That taste didn't last long. After the offensive began, after the world dissolved into thunder and mud and screaming metal at Kursk, the good food was the first thing to go. It happened so slowly you almost didn't notice at first. The butter became margarine. The real coffee became that awful barley brew. The bread started to change. It got darker, heavier, as if they were baking sawdust into it. It would sit in your stomach like a stone. The rations shrank. A loaf that used to feed 3 men now had to feed 5. Then 6. You get your portion, this hard, dark wedge, and you try to make it last, nibbling at the edges, saving a crust for the morning. But the hunger was a constant, gnawing companion, sharper than the fear sometimes. Your belly would ache with this hollow emptiness that made it hard to think of anything else. The Russians out there in their positions, they were the enemy, sure, but the hunger was right here, inside you, an enemy you couldn't shoot. We started getting these tins of meat. They called it Schlachtschüssel or something grand, but it was a mystery. Grey, gristly, swimming in a congealed fat that turned white in the cold. You couldn't tell if it was pork, horse, or something else entirely. You just heat it up in your mess tin over a little flame, and the smell, it wasn't a good smell. It was the smell of desperation. The hunger does things to you. It strips away the civilized man and leaves something older, more primal. You stop being a soldier and you start being an animal just trying to find the next meal, We'd scavenge for anything. A frozen potato left in a field we'd overrun, we'd fight over it like dogs. We found a cellar once, in what was left of a village, and it had jars of pickled beets. I'd never been so happy to see a beet in my life. We ate them cold, the vinegar sharp on our tongues, and it was a feast. You'd see men trading their last cigarettes for a spoonful of sugar, a piece of chocolate from a care package that had somehow, miraculously, gotten through. The packages from home, that was a special kind of torture. You get one, maybe once in a blue moon, and it was like Christmas. But then you had to decide, do I eat this precious sausage from my mother now, in one go, satisfying this raging hunger for a few glorious minutes, or do I hoard it, parcel it out tiny piece by tiny piece, making it last for days, a little taste of home to keep you sane? Most of the time, the hunger one. You devour it, and then feel immediately guilty, like you de-wasted something sacred. The cold became another kind of hunger, a deep chill that settled in your bones and never left. You de-huddle in a foxhole with Willie sharing body heat, our breath misting in the air, and our stomachs would growl in unison, a sad, hollow duet. The world shrank down to the size of your own misery. The grand strategy, the great push for victory, it all faded away. The only objective was the next scrap of food, the next warm place to sleep. The war became very, very simple. Survive until the next meal. Then survive until the one after that. And then you'd hear it. Maybe from a loudspeaker truck that had come up to the front, or from a field radio someone had managed to keep working. The newsreel voice. That voice. It was always so confident, so booming, so full of certainty. It would cut through the moaning of the wind, and we'd stop what we were doing, listening. And it would tell the folks back home about the heroic struggle in the East, about the unshakable spirit of the German soldier, about our well-supplied troops holding the line against the Bolshevik hordes. Well-supplied. I heard that word once, clear as day, while I was sitting on the edge of my hole trying to chew on a piece of hardtack. That stuff, you couldn't really call it bread. It was like trying to eat a piece of the sidewalk. You had to soak it in your coffee or soup for 10 minutes just to get your teeth into it, and it tasted of nothing, nothing at all. Well-supplied. I looked down at this grey, crumbling biscuit in my filthy hand. I looked at my mess tin, which had a thin, watery stew in it that was mostly turnip. I looked at Willie, who was staring into the distance with sunken eyes, his cheeks hollow. And someone, I think it was Klaus, let out a sound. It wasn't a cry. It was a dry, rasping laugh, a sound with no joy in it whatsoever. It was the sound of a man who has just seen the bottom of the barrel and found it empty. That laugh was more powerful than any shout of anger. It was the end of belief. That bitter laughter spread through us, a quiet, hopeless chuckle that was the only honest response to such a magnificent lie. How could you believe the words coming from Berlin when the emptiness in your own stomach was the truest thing you knew? The propaganda wasn't just wrong. It was a joke, a cruel, pathetic joke that everyone was in on except the people telling it. The newsreels showed us victorious, fed, strong. We knew we were defeated, starving, and hanging on by a thread. The gap between the words and the reality was so wide you could fall into it and never hit the bottom. So if it wasn't the food from the quartermaster, and it wasn't the lies from the radio, what kept us going, it was something else, a different kind of sustenance. It was the warmth of a tin cup of tea, not real tea, mind you, but some leaves we'd liberated from an abandoned farmhouse, brewed over a tiny, smokeless fire in a muddy hole. It wasn't the taste, it was the act of sharing it. Passing the cup from frozen hand to frozen hand, each man taking a sip, feeling the hot liquid sear a path down your throat and into your belly, a tiny spot of warmth in a world of cold. It was the cigarette that was lit and passed around, each man taking 2 deep pulls before handing it to the next guy. You didn't smoke for pleasure. You smoked for the warmth, for the shared ritual, for a few seconds where you weren't thinking about the Russians or the hunger. It was Willie, seeing me shivering uncontrollably one night, silently unrolling his ground sheet and throwing half of it over me without a word. It was the dark, grim humor. We'd joke about the food, calling the mystery meat Old Brown Horse, and making bets on what was really in it. We'd joke about dying. It sounds macabre, but you have to understand, it was the only way to look the horror in the face without going mad. "Hey, if a shell has my name on it," Klaus would say, "at least I won't have to eat another mouthful of that damned hardtack." And we'd laugh, a real laugh this time, because it was true. That camaraderie, that was the real ration. It was thin, and it didn't fill your belly, but it kept your soul from completely withering away. You learned to read the silence between men. You knew when someone was at the breaking point. You just sit with them, shoulder to shoulder, not saying anything, because there was nothing left to say. Words had lost their meaning. But presence still mattered. The only truth left in the world was the man next to you. His breath on the air, the weight of him leaning against you in the trench, the way he'd nod when you handed him the cup. Berlin was a distant fantasy, a place of bright lights and full bellies that had nothing to do with us. The fatherland was an idea that had stopped sending bread. But my kameraden, they were real. Their survival was my survival. Their small acts of kindness were the only miracles I still believed in. I remember one time, during a lull in the shelling, we found a wild apple tree, stripped bare of course, but there was one lone, withered apple clinging to a high branch. Willie, being the tallest, managed to knock it down. It was small, probably sour, but he didn't eat it. He came back and divided it meticulously into 3 equal pieces with his knife. It was the most fair thing I had seen in months. We ate those sour pieces of apple, and it was better than any feast I'd ever had back home, because it was shared. That's what we fought for in the end, not for flags, or for leaders, or for some grand ideology. We fought for the man on our left and the man on our right. We fought so that Willie wouldn't have to die alone in the mud. We fought so that Klaus might actually get home to that girl in Hamburg. The war, the real war, wasn't about maps and arrows anymore. It was about that shared cup of terrible tea, that last cigarette, that piece of sour apple. That was the only victory that mattered anymore, just making it through one more day together. And every time you did, you tasted a small, bittersweet kind of victory, a victory that had nothing to do with the newsreels and everything to do with the simple, stubborn will to remain human in the face of everything that was trying to turn you into an animal. That taste, the taste of shared struggle, that's the one that stays with you, long after the memory of the hunger has faded. You know, they have this term for it now, the 1,000-yard stare. They see it in the photographs, the ones from the Pacific, from the bulge, the hollowed-out eyes of a man who's seen too much. I never needed a term for it. I just called it the look, and you saw it in the faces of the men who'd been there, the ones who'd made it through the meat grinders like Stalingrad. I had that look long before I ever heard the word Kursk. By the time we were loaded onto those trains, heading east again in the summer of '43, the hope, the belief it was already a ghost inside me. It was a weight in my pack, heavier than any mortar round, a cold certainty that this was just the next chapter in a story that only ended one way. You stand on the station platform, the locomotive hissing like some tired iron beast, and you watch the new boys, the fresh-faced replacements straight out of the Reich with their polished boots and their heads full of newsreel victories. They're laughing, joking, their faith in the high command, and the final victory still bright and untarnished. And you look at them, and you don't feel scorn, you feel a pity so deep it aches in your bones, because you know what's waiting for them. You've smelled it. You've tasted it. It's the same stench that clung to the Volga, the same taste of dust and despair. Stalingrad taught you to read the signs, to see the disaster in the making long before the first shell screams in. It's in the eyes of the junior officers, the ones who still believe the rhetoric they learned in war college. You see the flicker of doubt when they're given an objective that any fool with a map can see is suicide. It's in the supply reports, the promises of new Panthers and Tigers that are always just a week away, while we're patching up our Panzer IIIs with sheet metal and prayers. It's in the silence that falls over a veteran squad when some political officer starts spouting about unstoppable offensives and Bolshevik weakness. We just look at our boots or share a cigarette, our silence a louder protest than any shout could ever be. We were the men who'd seen the Siberian divisions materialize out of the snow, who'd fought for a single room in a factory for weeks, who knew that the Russian soldier wasn't some subhuman brute, but a stubborn, tough bastard who could endure hell itself and still come at you. So when the orders came down for this grand offensive, this citadel at Kursk, it felt like déjà vu, but on a scale so monstrous it made your stomach turn. It was Stalingrad's ghost, dressed up in shiny new armor. And then we got there. The front was quiet, too quiet, the way it gets when two giants are holding their breath before they swing. The air itself felt thick, charged. And the smell, that was the first thing that hit you, the smell that meant catastrophe. It's a smell you never forget. It's the smell of a battlefield before the first shot is even fired. It's the oily scent of tens of thousands of engines, the faint, sweet smell of crushed crops and earth, and underneath it all, the ghost of things to come. The cordite, the burned steel, the rot. It's the same smell that hung over the approaches to Stalingrad. You take a deep breath and your knees would feel a little weak, because you knew, you just knew. We dug in, our foxholes and trenches facing this vast, rolling Russian plain, and you could feel the eyes on you, a million eyes from the other side. It was like the whole earth was watching, waiting. The newsreels back home talked about our invincible panzers, our elite soldiers, the might of the German war machine. But sitting in that hole, feeling the vibrations of our own tanks moving up, all I could think was that we were a handful of pebbles being thrown against a mountain. Then the dawn came and the world ended. That's what it sounded like. Not like a battle, but like the sky was being torn in two. Our artillery opened up, a thunder that was so loud you felt it in your teeth, a constant, hammering roar that went on for what felt like hours. And then, silence. For a few heartbeats, nothing. And then the reply. The Soviet artillery wasn't just thunder, it was a symphony of annihilation. It came down not in barrages, but in a solid, rolling wave of fire and steel. The ground shook like a living thing, and you're pressed into the dirt at the bottom of your hole, praying that the next one doesn't have your name on it. The concussions punch the air from your lungs, dirt and rocks rain down on your helmet, and all you can do is curl into a ball and wait. You're not a soldier anymore in those moments. You're a scared animal waiting for the trap to spring. And through it all, you hear the screams not of men, but of the land itself, the shriek of tearing metal as a half-track is flipped over, the crump of a direct hit on an ammunition dump. The air gets so thick with smoke, and dust you can taste it, a gritty, bitter paste on your tongue. That's when you see it in the eyes of the new lieutenant, the one who was so full of fire the day before. The shelling stops, and he stands up, his face pale, his hands shaking so bad he can barely hold his map. He looks out at the smoke-shrouded hellscape, at the craters and the wreckage, and you see the newsreel fantasy die right there, in real time. The belief just drains out of his face, replaced by the raw, terrified understanding of what he's been sent into. He's not an officer anymore. He's just a boy who's realized he's been lied to. The days that followed were a blur of noise, fire, and death. The great tank battle they talk about now, that was happening a few kilometers away, but for us in the infantry, it was a close-up, personal nightmare. The Russian defenses were unbelievable. Layer upon layer of trenches, minefields so thick you'd think they'd planted every piece of metal in the Soviet Union in the ground, and anti-tank guns everywhere. They'd let our tanks push forward into these killing zones, these pockets, and then they'd close the trap. We'd be following behind, trying to clear trenches, and you'd see a tiger, this magnificent, fearsome beast, hit a mine that would blow a track off. It would sit there, immobilized, a giant metal target, and within minutes the Russian anti-tank rifles and artillery would zero in. You'd see the crew try to bail out, and the machine gun fire would cut them down before they'd taken 2 steps. It was a slaughter. We weren't advancing. We were wading through a river of our own blood and steel. The heat was unbearable, the dust coating your throat, your eyes. You'd run out of water and be reduced to drinking from a muddy puddle, not caring about the floaters in it, just needing something wet to stop your tongue from sticking to the roof of your mouth. And the flies, God, the flies. They were everywhere, a constant, buzzing plague feasting on the dead that were too numerous to bury. You'd try to eat a piece of hardtack, and you'd be swatting them away from your face, from your food. The smell of death is something you can't describe to someone who hasn't smelled it. It's sweet and cloying, and it gets into your clothes, your hair, your soul. You smell it in your dreams. You'd look at your buddies, the men you'd trained with, shared your last cigarette with, and you'd see the same hollow look in their eyes. The dark humor, the last defense of a soldier, started to dry up. The jokes about the food, about the officers, they stopped. The silence was heavier, more profound. We were all thinking the same thing, but no one dared say it. Not yet. The turning point, the moment the last flicker of hope died for me, wasn't a single massive event. It was during the retreat. Yes, retreat. The great offensive had stalled, ground to a bloody halt, and then the Soviets hit back with a force that felt biblical. We were pulling back, what was left of us, a ragged, exhausted column of men who were more ghost than soldier. We were trudging down a dirt road, the sounds of Russian tanks not far behind. I remember stumbling, my boot catching on something. I looked down, and it was the body of a Russian soldier, half buried in the mud. But it wasn't the body that caught my eye. It was his boot. It was a felt boot, Valenki they call them, already rotting off his foot. And next to him was one of our boys, a young kid from Hamburg, with his fine leather jackboots. And I just stared at that contrast. This Russian, with his primitive felt boots, had helped stop the most powerful army the world had ever seen. And we, with our engineering, our discipline, our panthers and tigers, were running. It wasn't a feeling of anger or even sadness. It was a cold, numb acceptance, like a bucket of ice water had been poured down my spine. The equation was simple and inescapable. They had more men. They had more tanks. They had more land to retreat into. They could lose 10 men for every one of us, and they would still win. The war wasn't a question of if we would lose, but when. The grand strategy, the newsreels talking about heroic last stands and turning points, it was all nonsense. It was a fairy tale they told to people who hadn't seen a felt boot. From that moment on, everything changed. My motivation, the reason I got up and fought, it shifted completely. It wasn't about fatherland or Fuhrer or final victory. Those words were empty, meaningless sounds. It was about the man next to me. It was about Schmidt, with his bad jokes and his photographs of his daughter. It was about young Weber, who was so scared he'd wet himself during the first barrage, but who still stood his ground. My war became very, very small. It was about making sure Schmidt and Weber and the other few veterans in my squad got through the day. It was about survival, pure and simple. You develop a sixth sense, you and the other old hares. You don't need to talk. A single glance across a crater, a slight nod of the head, and you know. You know that the lieutenant's order to hold a certain hill is suicide. You know that the rustle in the bushes ahead isn't the wind. It's a language of survival, spoken only with the eyes. And the new men, the ones who still had a shred of belief left, we'd take them aside. Not officially, not as an order. You'd just find a moment, maybe sharing a cigarette during a lull in the fighting. And you wouldn't talk about glory, you'd talk about practical things. See that clump of trees over there, son? Don't run for it in a straight line. Zigzag makes you a harder target. Or keep your head down when the mortars come, the shrapnel flies upwards. Or the most important lesson, don't be a hero. Heroes get buried, be smart, live to see tomorrow. It was advice about staying alive, not about winning. And they'd listen, their eyes wide, starting to understand. The newsreels became a kind of background noise, a distant, absurd comedy show. Sometimes, if we were lucky enough to be rotated to a quiet sector and some fool would set up a projector, we'd watch them. We'd see the clean, handsome soldiers on the screen, the pristine tanks rolling through cheering crowds, the maps with sweeping arrows indicating glorious advances. And we'd just shake our heads. Some of the boys would laugh, a bitter, hollow laugh. Others would just get up and walk away. The disconnect between that fantasy and the reality of the mud, the blood, and the flies was too painful to even contemplate. The lies weren't even angering anymore. They were just pathetic. The last stretch, the long, miserable retreat back towards the Dnieper, was the final confirmation. It was a rout, a disintegration. We weren't an army anymore. We were a mob of desperate, starving men. The discipline that had held us together at Stalingrad was gone, broken on the plains of Kursk. I saw things then that still haunt me. Officers shooting their own men for looting a loaf of bread. Horses being slaughtered for meat where they fell. The look of sheer animal terror in everyone's eyes. I remember stumbling into an abandoned farmhouse with Schmidt and Weber. We found a radio, a civilian one, and for a laugh, Schmidt turned it on. A German station was broadcasting a symphony, something by Beethoven. The music was so beautiful, so pure, so utterly divorced from the reality of our shattered, stinking existence. We sat there in the dark, listening to it, and I looked at Schmidt, and he looked at me, and in that glance was everything. The years of fighting, the friends we'd lost, the homes we'd never see again, the utter futility of it all. There were no words. None were needed. The 1,000-yard stare wasn't just a look anymore. It was who we were. It was the face of a man who had seen the future and knew it held only one thing for him, a long, hard road home with a ghost for a companion. And the newsreels, they were just the chattering of the ghosts who had sent us there. The pencil felt heavy in my hand, heavier than my rifle ever had, and that's saying something. It was one of those stolen moments, after the shelling had stopped, but before the patrols went out, when the front line held its breath. The only sounds were the distant crackle of a burning farmhouse and the low murmur of my buddies trying to find sleep in their holes. I'd found a relatively dry spot to sit, my back against the cold, damp earth of the trench wall, and I'd pulled out my precious piece of paper, smoothed it against my knee. It was creased and smudged with dirt, but it was my connection to you, to home. I could picture you all so clearly, gathered around the big radio in the parlor, the warm glow of the lamp on your faces, listening to the same newsreels we used to believe in, the ones with the booming voice talking about our unshakable will and heroic advances. I could see Mutty's proud smile, Vatty's firm nod. And here I was, a world away in this stinking pit in Russia, trying to find words that could bridge the impassable chasm between that clean, orderly world and this one. My first instinct was always to tell you the truth, to pour it all out, to let you know what this really was. But then I'd see your faces, and I knew I couldn't. My job wasn't to tell the truth anymore, it was to protect you from it. So every letter became this terrible war inside me, a battle between the need to be honest and the duty to shield you. I'd start to write something simple like, "Our position is strong," and my hand would just freeze. Strong, what did that even mean? A position isn't strong when it's just a hole in the mud that might collapse on you or fill with water from the next rain. A position is strong when you have hot food, dry socks, and enough men to hold the line without every one of us feeling the weight of 10 miles of front on our shoulders. I'd scratch the words out, the pencil lead tearing the paper a little. I wanted to describe the real things, the things that haunted me. I wanted to tell you about the sound a man makes when he's hit in the stomach, a sound that's not human, more like an animal caught in a trap. I wanted to describe the smell, God, the smell. It's not just cordite and smoke. It's the sweet, cloying stench of death that gets into your clothes, your hair, the back of your throat, a smell you taste for days. I wanted to write about the bone-deep exhaustion that makes your hands shake so bad you can barely light a cigarette, about the constant, gnawing fear that's like a cold stone in your gut from the moment you wake up to the moment you try to sleep, if sleep even comes. But how could I put that in a letter to you? You'd read it, and your world would shatter. So instead, I'd write the cheerful cliches. The food is adequate. That meant we'd found a half-rotten potato in a field. The morale of the men is high. That meant France had told a dirty joke, and we'd managed a weak laugh. Every word I managed to write felt like a betrayal, a lie painted in bright colors over a canvas of mud and blood. The screaming truth in my head was so loud, it was a miracle the words on the page didn't just bleed right off it. And then I did the worst thing, the thing that made me feel like the biggest traitor of all. I actually quoted one of those damned newsreels. I wrote, as the reports say, the Führer's strategic genius continues to guide us. I wrote that. I fed you the same poison they were feeding you over the airwaves. I did it because I thought it would give you comfort, a sense of normalcy. If you read that I was hearing the same things you were, then maybe you could believe that everything was, if not fine, at least according to some grand plan. It was an act of love, I told myself, a necessary lie to let you sleep at night. But it felt like I was spitting on the graves of my friends, on the truth of what we had become. It created this profound loneliness, this feeling that I was living two lives. There was the life I wrote about for you, the clean-shaven soldier serving his country with pride. And then there was the real life, the one in the filth, surrounded by boys who were turning into old men before their time, who flinched at every bird taking flight, because for a split second it sounded like an incoming shell. That double life was more exhausting than any march, any battle. You start to forget which version of yourself is real. I looked down at the finished letter. It was full of empty phrases and hollow reassurance. It was a ghost of a letter, written by a ghost of the man I used to be. I couldn't send it. I just couldn't. My hand crumpled it into a tight ball, the paper crackling in the silence of my corner of the trench. I shoved it deep into my pocket, feeling the grit of the dirt on it against my fingers. It felt like a weight, a secret. Then I took out another sheet, a smaller one, and I wrote the only true thing I could send. My dearest family, I am alive and well. I think of you always, your loving son. That was it, nothing more, because anything more would have been a lie. I sealed that short, bleak note and put it aside to be collected. But the other letter, the one I never sent, I kept. It became my secret diary, my confession. a testament to the vast, silent chasm that had opened up between the front and the homeland, a chasm that no words, no newsreel, no letter could ever hope to cross. You know, it's funny the things you remember. It's never the big battles, not really. Oh, you remember the noise and the fear, but the details get fuzzy, blurred together by terror and time. What you remember are the small things, the human things. Like the taste of that ersatz coffee in the morning, bitter and thin, but it was hot. And on a cold morning in Russia, hot is everything. You remember the feel of a dry pair of socks after your feet have been wet and frozen for a week, a feeling of pure luxury that no king in his castle could ever appreciate more. You remember the sound of a harmonica playing a sad song from home when the night was quiet, and for a few minutes, the war just stopped. And you remember the faces. Not the ones in the newspapers, but the faces of the boys next to you in the trench. Like little Klaus, who was only 17 and still had pimples on his chin, who cried for his mother the first time he saw a man die. Or old man Schmidt, who'd been a carpenter before the war and was always whittling little figures out of bits of wood, a tiny bird for a crying child in a village we passed through. We were just a bunch of guys, from cities and farms, who'd been thrown into this meat grinder. And Kursk, God, Kursk, the newsreels called it a defensive victory, a strategic withdrawal. They showed you pictures of our mighty tigers, invincible, rolling across the steppe. They didn't show you what it was like inside one of those steel coffins when a Russian anti-tank round punched through the armor. They didn't show you the crewmen burning alive, their screams echoing in the metal box until the ammunition cooked off. They didn't show you the fields littered with the hulks of our invincible tanks, picked over by crows, the smell of roasted meat and oil hanging over everything for weeks. They didn't show you the endless waves of Russian infantry coming on, no matter how many we cut down. It was like trying to stop the ocean with a shovel. Before Kursk, there was still a flicker of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, the High Command knew what they were doing, that there was a plan, that this immense suffering was leading to something. After Kursk, that flicker went out. It was replaced by a cold, hard certainty that we were just cannon fodder, that the men in charge were gambling with lives they didn't value, and that we were on the losing side of the bet. The retreat. They never call it a retreat in the newsreels, do they? It's a repositioning of forces. Let me tell you about repositioning. It's walking for days with no sleep, your feet bleeding in your boots, your stomach clawing at your spine from hunger. It's drinking water from ditches that you know are probably contaminated with cholera because there's nothing else. It's the look in the eyes of the Russian peasants as you pass through their villages, a look of pure hatred that you can feel like a physical blow. And it's the fear, a constant, grinding fear that's worse than the fear of battle. In a battle, it's loud and fast, and you're too busy trying to stay alive to think. On a retreat, you have nothing but time to think. You think about the partisans in the forests who could ambush you at any moment. You think about the Russian tanks that could come rumbling over the next hill. You think about the commissars who offered no quarter, and you knew what that meant for a captured German soldier. Every shadow in the woods was a threat, every sound a potential death sentence. That kind of fear eats away at your soul. It makes you jumpy, paranoid. You start seeing things. I remember once, in the middle of the night, I was on sentry duty, and I was sure I saw a Russian soldier standing just beyond the tree line. I raised my rifle, my heart hammering against my ribs, my finger tightening on the trigger. I was about to shoot when the moon came out from behind a cloud, and I saw it was just a broken tree stump, a trick of the light. I almost killed a tree stump. That's what retreat does to you. It turns you into a nervous wreck, a shell of a man. And through it all, the newsreels kept coming. We get these film canisters sometimes, and they'd set up a projector in some barn or a ruined schoolhouse, and we'd all gather round to watch. It was like watching a play about another war, a clean war, a war where everyone was handsome and brave, and the machines never broke down, and the dead were just tidy bundles wrapped in flags. They'd show these maps with big, bold arrows showing our elastic defense, and we'd just look at each other and shake our heads. Elastic defense. We called it running for our lives. There was this one reporter, his voice was so smooth, so confident. He'd talk about fierce local fighting and enemy losses 10 times our own. We'd just sit there in the dark, covered in mud, stinking of sweat and fear, and listen to this nonsense. and you could feel the cynicism growing, a thick, bitter crust forming over whatever idealism we might have had left. The dark humor was our only defense. After one particularly ridiculous report about our unbreakable spirit, Werner leaned over to me and whispered, "Yeah, unbreakable, like my grandmother's china. Already in a million pieces, but they keep saying it's fine." We laughed, but it was a hollow laugh, the laugh of men who know they're being lied to and are powerless to do anything about it. That's why the letters became so impossible. How do you write to your mother about this? How do you describe the feeling of digging a foxhole in the frozen ground, your fingers going numb, knowing that this hole might be your grave? How do you tell your father about the friends you've lost, boys you grew up with, whose faces you still see in your dreams? You can't, so you write about the weather. You write about the parcel she sent, the socks and the chocolate that was mostly melted but tasted like heaven. You write about anything but the war is all there is. It's in every breath you take, in every thought you have. It's the background noise of your life. So the letters become these strange, stilted things, full of gaps and silences. You become an actor, playing the part of the brave soldier for an audience you love too much to frighten. I think the lowest point for me was after a skirmish near a river crossing. We'd been pinned down for hours, and when it was over, we had to search the Russian bodies for intelligence. It was a grim business, one you never get used to. On one young soldier, no older than Klaus, I found a letter. It was tucked inside his tunic, next to his heart. It was written in Cyrillic, of course, so I couldn't read it, but I didn't need to. I could guess what it said. It was from his mother or his sweetheart. It was full of the same hopes, the same fears, the same love that was in the letters I tried to write to you. This boy on the other side of the war, this enemy, he was just like me. He missed his home, he was scared, he was trying to survive. I looked at his pale, still face, and I felt nothing but a terrible, overwhelming sadness. What were we doing here? What was any of this for? I took the letter and buried it with him when we dug the grave. It seemed like the right thing to do. That night I tried to write to you. I picked up my pencil, and I just stared at the blank page. All I could see was the face of that Russian boy and the letter next to his heart. The words wouldn't come. They felt meaningless. What could I possibly say that wouldn't be a lie? The gulf between our world and yours felt wider than the ocean, wider than the Russian steppe itself. That's when I started the unsent letters. It became a ritual. After a bad day, after seeing something that would haunt me, I'd find a quiet moment, and I'd write down what really happened. I'd write down the fear, the anger, the despair. I'd write about Werner getting a piece of shrapnel in his leg and screaming for his mother until we got a morphine syringe into him. I'd write about the taste of fear, like copper pennies in your mouth. I'd write about the dreams I had, where I was home, and everything was normal, and then I'd wake up to the sound of artillery, and the dream would shatter like glass. I wrote it all down, every dirty, horrible detail. And then I'd crumple the paper and stuff it in my pocket with the others. It was my way of screaming without making a sound. It was my way of staying sane, of keeping some tiny part of myself separate from the soldier, separate from the killing and the dying. Those crumpled balls of paper in my pocket were the real me. The letters I actually sent were just a shadow. As the war went on and things got worse and worse, the newsreels became a complete joke. They talk about secret weapons that would turn the tide, about final victory that was always just around the corner. We'd listen to this and we'd just feel tired. We knew it was over. We knew we were losing. The evidence was all around, using the dwindling rations, in the lack of fuel, in the faces of the fresh-faced boys they sent to replace the veterans, boys who would be dead in a week. The disconnect was absolute. It was like the high command was living on a different planet, a planet where up was down and black was white. And we were stuck here, on the real planet, in the mud and the blood, waiting for the end. When the end finally came for me, it wasn't in some glorious last stand. It was in a muddy field hospital with the smell of disinfectant and death, my leg wrapped in bloody bandages. An American medic gave me a cigarette and looked at me not with hatred, but with a kind of weary pity. And in that moment, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was over. The running, the fighting, the lying, it was over. They took my uniform, my paybook, and the few personal effects I had left. And in my pocket, they found the letters, the ones I never sent. A handful of crumpled, dirty papers filled with the truth of a war that no newsreel would ever show. I often wonder what happened to them. Did some clerk just toss them in the trash? Did they end up in some archive somewhere, a silent testimony to what it was really like? I don't know. But I kept writing them right up until the end. Because in a world of lies, those unsent letters were the only truth I had left. They were my story. Not the story of the heroic soldier in the newsreel, but the story of a scared boy who missed his home, who saw his friends die, and who just wanted to survive. And that, I think, is the story of most of us. The story you never hear in the movies. The story written on crumpled paper and carried in the heart long after the guns have fallen silent.